The woman at the door of the morning sun was soft and golden when Sundar Pichai walked into the quiet office building, thinking it would be just another day. He had a full schedule, meetings, calls, and a handful of interviews. But he didn't know that one of those interviews would change his life forever. The reception was already busy when he arrived. People in suits sat on the gray couches, holding their resumes, glancing nervously at their phones. Sundar nodded politely to the receptionist, who smiled but looked a little flustered. And he noticed an old woman stood at the far corner of the room, wearing a faded blue sari. Her hands clutched a brown envelope, and her face was calm yet tired, lined with years of stories no one had asked to hear. She didn't seem to belong there, among the polished shoes and shiny laptops. She didn't even sit down. She just stood there, waiting. Sundar stopped. Something about her quiet strength, her stillness, drew him in. He walked up, smiling kindly. "You must be here for the interview," he said softly. The woman nodded. Her eyes glistened for a second as though she was holding back tears, before Sundar could say anything else. His assistant hurried over and whispered that they were behind schedule. So he led the old woman into the small interview room at the end of the hall. Once inside, she sat down and placed the envelope on the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it and pulled out a resume, handwritten on plain paper. Sundar was taken aback. The resume listed jobs like tailor, cleaner, and cook. There were no degrees, no certificates. Yet every line spoke of years of hard work and quiet resilience. He cleared his throat. "Can you tell me why you want this job?" he asked gently. The woman looked up, and for the first time, Sundar saw the depth in her eyes. "My son is in the hospital," she said. "He had an accident last week. I need money to pay for his treatment." The words struck Sundar like a hammer. There was something about the way she said it, no self-pity, no begging, just simple truth, that made his chest tighten. He leaned forward. "What happened to him?" The woman hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her sari. "A car hit him while he was crossing the road. The doctors say he may not walk again. I cannot lose him." The room fell silent except for the faint move the air conditioner. Sundar stared at her, feeling an ache he couldn't explain. He thought about his own mother back in India, how hard she had worked to give him a chance in life. And now here was another mother fighting alone. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the table. It was his assistant, reminding him that another candidate was waiting. He picked up the phone to send a quick reply, and froze. The screen displayed a news alert. "Young man in critical condition after hit and run. Mother appeals for help." There was a blurry photo below the headline. The old woman was in the picture, standing outside the hospital, tears streaking her face. Sundar's hands went cold. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, still calm, still waiting. He swallowed hard. Is that your son?" She nodded silently. He couldn't find the words. His mind was racing. How had she managed to leave his bedside and come here? Why hadn't she asked for help outright? And why was she trying to get a job instead of charity? Then, before he could speak again, the woman stood up. She slid the resume toward him and said quietly, "Thank you for seeing me. I will wait to hear from you." And with that, she turned and walked out of the room. Sundar sat frozen in his chair, staring at the door she had just closed. His heart thudded in his chest. He didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary interview. And this was no ordinary woman. Just then, his assistant knocked and stepped inside, holding another file. "Next candidate is ready," she said cheerfully. But Sundar shook his head. He stood up, grabbed the old woman's resume, and hurried out into the hallway, only to find it empty. She was gone. He ran to the elevator, but the doors had already closed. He sprinted to the lobby, scanning the crowd, but there was no sign of her. Then, just as he stepped outside, he caught sight of her crossing the street. And then a horn blared. A car came screeching around the corner, and Sundar's breath caught as he watched the car heading straight toward her. Asterisk. The moment that changed everything, the sound of the car horn was deafening in the still morning air. Sundar's feet felt like they were glued to the ground as he watched the scene unfold in slow motion. The old woman, her blue sari fluttering slightly in the breeze, was halfway across the street, unaware of the car speeding toward her. The driver was leaning on the horn now, but the gap was closing too fast. Too close. Time fractured into jagged pieces in Sundar's mind. He saw her pause for just a second, turning her head toward the noise. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. Not in fear, but in quiet resignation, as if she had already lived through worse moments and was ready to face this one too. Something in that look, that quiet acceptance, made Sundar's heart hammer in his chest. Without thinking, without planning, he lunged forward. He shouted her name, though he didn't even know her name, and his voice cracked as it tore through the air. The old woman turned toward him just as he reached her. His hand caught her thin arm and he pulled hard, so hard that she stumbled backward onto the sidewalk, landing heavily against the curb. Sundar fell with her, the car whooshing past him so close that its side mirror clipped his sleeve. The smell of burnt rubber and the screech of tires hung in the air for a long, breathless second. When it was over, he realized his chest was heaving, and his hands were shaking. The old woman lay on the sidewalk beside him, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her sari bunched and dusty. Sundar leaned over her, checking if she was hurt. For a moment she didn't say anything, just looked at him with wide, stunned eyes, and then finally whispered, "Thank you." He sat back on his heels, still trembling. The driver of the car had already sped away without stopping, leaving only a faint trail of smoke behind. Sundar wanted to stand up and chase after the car, to demand answers, but something in the old woman's fragile silence kept him there. He helped her sit up, gently brushing the dust off her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded faintly. But her hands were still shaking, and her eyes were suddenly full of tears she could no longer hold back. Sundar stood and held out his hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's go somewhere safe." Together, they walked back inside the building. The receptionist and a few others stared at them as they passed, whispers following in their wake. Sundar ignored them all. He guided the old woman to a quiet conference room, closed the door, and poured her a glass of water. She drank it slowly, her hands still unsteady for a long moment. Neither of them spoke. The faint ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. Then Sundar sat down opposite her and took a deep breath. "You came here," he said carefully, "not to ask for help, not to beg. You came to earn." She lifted her eyes to his, and though they shimmered with exhaustion, they still held a quiet dignity. "I am not someone to beg," she replied. "If I can work, I will work." Her words sank deep into him, heavier than he expected. He thought about how many people he had interviewed over the years, young, polished, confident, all of them selling themselves with clever words and crisp suits. Yet none of them had moved him like this woman, sitting here with her calloused hands folded in her lap and her sorrow barely hidden behind her quiet determination. "What's your name?" he asked. "Shanta," she said. "Shanta," he repeated, softly. "And your son, he's in the hospital. What is his name?" "Vikram," she said. And for the first time her voice broke just slightly. "They say he may not walk again." The words hung between them, heavy and sharp. Sundar leaned back, feeling an ache in his chest he couldn't explain. He thought of his own son, his small hand fitting perfectly into his. The thought of that boy lying in a hospital bed, hurt and helpless, made Sundar's throat tighten. He looked at Shanta again and saw not just a mother in pain, but a fighter, someone who had carried burdens silently for years, yet still chose to stand tall. "Ben." Shanta reached into her envelope again and pulled out a small photograph. She slid it across the table toward him. It showed a young man, probably in his 20s, lying on a hospital bed, pale and unconscious, tubes snaking from his arms. Sundar stared at the photo for a long moment. Something about the boy's face, the quiet strength even in his stillness, reminded him of someone. But he couldn't place it. "How did you find this place?" He asked quietly. Sant. I looked down at her hands. I saw a notice on the wall outside, she said. Someone said they were hiring. I thought, maybe if I try, they will let me. Sweep the floors or clean the rooms. Anything. Sundar felt something tighten inside him, a kind of shame mixed with admiration. Here was a woman willing to risk everything, even her pride, just to keep her son alive. He realized then how little he truly understood about the quiet struggles people faced. Even as he sat in his office making decisions that shaped their lives, but before he could say anything more, there was a sudden knock at the door. He turned and saw his assistant looking nervous. Sir, she said hesitantly, there's something you need to see. Not now, Sundar replied firmly. I think you'll want to, she insisted, her eyes darting toward Shanta. Reluctantly, he rose from his chair and followed her out of the room. Shanta watched him go, her expression unreadable. Outside in the hallway, his assistant handed him a tablet. On the screen was a news report, live footage from outside the hospital where Shanta's son was being treated. A crowd of reporters surrounded the entrance. The headline at the bottom of the screen made his stomach drop. Hospital refuses further treatment for hit-and-run victim. Mother pleads for help. Video showed Shanta's son being wheeled out of a room on a stretcher, his face contorted in pain. A doctor stood nearby, explaining that the hospital could no longer cover the costs of his care. The reporters shoved microphones toward him, asking questions he didn't answer. Sundar's hands tightened around the tablet. He turned back toward the conference room, but when he opened, the chair was empty. The envelope was still on the table, but Shanta was gone. Panic rose in his chest. He ran back into the hallway, scanning the building, but she was nowhere to be seen. He rushed to the lobby, then outside onto the street. But it was as though she had vanished into thin air. He stood there, the hot sun beating down on him, feeling helpless and confused. He didn't know where she had gone or what he could do next. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away. Not now. And then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered it without thinking. And a strange, unfamiliar voice said quietly, if you care about that woman, you need to come to the hospital, now, before it's too late. The line went dead. Sundar stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind was racing with questions, but one thought rose above the rest. He couldn't let this story end here. He turned and started walking toward the street, determination burning in his chest. But he didn't notice the black car parked across the road, its tinted windows hiding the driver's watchful eyes. Asterisk the hospital doorst, phone in Sundar's hand, felt heavy. The strange voice still echoing in his ears. He stared at the black screen for a long moment, as though it might explain itself. But it stayed silent, cold, unhelpful. The sun above him was merciless now, beating down on his back as the street hummed with cars and hurried footsteps, all of them oblivious to the storm gathering inside him. He turned his head toward the road, and that's when he saw the black car. It was parked across the street, its windows dark as obsidian, the engine running quietly. He couldn't see who was inside, but he could feel the weight of their gaze on him, like a chill in the heat of the day. He looked at it for a moment, longer, then slipped his phone into his pocket and began walking. The streets around the office melted into a blur as he moved, each step faster than the last. He passed bright storefronts, noisy traffic, mothers holding children's hands, young men laughing as they leaned against motorbikes, yet none of it registered. His mind was consumed by Shanta's quiet face, the desperation in her eyes, the photo of her son lying helpless in the hospital bed. And now this strange caller, this warning, before it's too late. Too late for what? What do they mean? And who are they? He flagged down a passing taxi and slid into the back seat. The driver glanced at him in the mirror and said nothing, as Sundar gave him the name of the hospital. The car lurched forward into the maze of traffic, horns blaring all around them. Inside the cab, Sundar felt his hands tightening into fists on his lap. The city outside the window became a river of color and sound. But he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was closing in. that something bigger than he understood was already in motion when the taxi finally pulled up to the hospital entrance. He stepped out and was immediately met by a wave of noise. Reporters crowded the front doors, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of questions and accusations. Families stood to the side, watching uneasily, as uniformed security guards tried to hold the crowd back. Sundar slipped through them as best he could, lowering his head so no one would recognize him. But even as he moved closer to the doors, he caught fragments of what they were shouting. Hospital refuses to operate. Mother claims doctors are abandoning her son. Who will pay for this young man's care? The words hit him like stones. He pushed harder, slipping through the throng, until finally he reached the glass doors and stepped inside. The air inside the hospital was cooler, but heavy with the scent of antiseptic and quiet despair. Nurses hurried past him with clipboards. A doctor barked orders to an intern, and somewhere nearby a child was crying softly. Sundar walked up to the front desk and leaned in. "I'm looking for a patient named Vikram," he said. He was admitted after a car accident. The nurse barely looked up as she scanned her computer screen. Then she frowned slightly and said, "He's in room 317, but they're about to move him." "Move him?" Sundar asked sharply. "Why?" But she had already turned to answer a phone call. Frustrated, he turned toward the elevators and jabbed the button dot as the doors closed behind him. He caught a glimpse of the black car again, this time parked just outside the hospital gates. His stomach tightened. On the third floor, the hallway was quiet, the only sound a faint beep from the heart monitors in nearby rooms. Sundar walked briskly down the corridor, scanning the numbers until he reached 317. He paused outside the door, his hand on the handle, and took a deep breath before pushing it open. The room was small and dim, the curtains drawn against the glare. Outside, Vikram lay in the bed, just as he'd seen in the photo, pale, motionless, tubes and wires trailing from his arms and chest. His breathing was shallow, his face still, but it wasn't just the sight of the young man that stopped Sundar in his tracks. It was Anta. She was there, sitting at his bedside, her hands resting lightly over her son's. Her sari was wrinkled now, and her hair had come loose from its bun, but her back was still straight, her shoulders still steady. She didn't look up when Sundar entered. She just kept staring at her son's face, whispering something too quiet for him to hear. "Shanta," Sundar said softly. She turned then, and for a brief moment, the mask of quiet strength slipped. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and her lips trembled before she pressed them together. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. He walked closer and stood at the foot of the bed. "I got a call," he said. "Someone told me to come. They said." Before it's too late, Shanta's gaze hardened slightly. She looked away and shook her head. "It may already be too late," she murmured. "What do you mean?" Just then, the door opened again. Two men entered, both wearing dark suits. They moved quietly, but there was a cold precision to them that made the air in the room tighten. One of them, taller, with a thin scar on his cheek, stepped forward and nodded slightly to Shanta. "Ma'am," he said, "it's time." Sundar frowned. "Time for what?" The man ignored him, keeping his eyes on Shanta. She rose slowly to her feet and smoothed her sari, her movements deliberate. Then she turned to Sundar and said, almost apologetically, "They're taking him away. They say there's nothing more this hospital can do." Sundar felt a rush of anger. And where will they take him? He needs treatment, not to be moved around like... But the other man cut him off, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, this is not your concern?" Sundar stared at him, stunned. "Not my concern?" Enough," Shanta interrupted softly. She looked at Sundar then, and though her voice was quiet, it carried an unexpected weight. "You've already done enough. For me, more than I expected." She stepped closer and pressed the envelope, the same one she had brought to the interview, into his hands. "Please," she said, her voice cracking just slightly, "don't follow me anymore. You've been kind. let that be enough. Before he could stop her, she turned back to her son. The two men moved to the bed, unhooking the monitors and lifting Vikram onto a stretcher. Sundar stood frozen, the envelope clutched in his hands as they wheeled the young man out of the room. Shanta followed, her head held high, though her shoulders now seemed heavier than before. When the door closed behind them, the silence left in their wake was deafening. Sundar sank into the chair by the bed, staring at the empty sheets, his mind. A storm of questions. Who were those men? Where were they taking Vikram? Why had Shanta looked so resigned, so certain there was nothing he could do? He opened the envelope slowly, his fingers trembling, and inside he found something new. A single folded piece of paper. It wasn't a resume this time. It was a letter. He unfolded it and began to read. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't tell you the truth in person, but you deserve to know. My son's accident was not an accident. And there are people who do not want you to help me. If you care about him, you must find the man in the black car. He knows everything. Sundar lowered the letter slowly, his breath coming faster now. The words burned in his mind like fire. Outside the window, down in the parking lot, the black car was still there. Waiting. Sundar stood up, the letter clenched tightly in his hand, and made his way to the door. He didn't know what he would say or what he would find, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing on the tile, and headed for the stairs. And behind him, unseen, a shadow slipped silently from one of the rooms, following. Asterisk. The man behind the glass stairwell was quiet and cold. Each step Sundar took echoing up and down the concrete walls. His breath came heavier now, not from the climb, but from the weight of what he'd just read. His fingers still clutched the letter so tightly it was starting to tear, yet he couldn't bring himself to let go. The words kept circling through his mind like a storm. It was not an accident. The man in the black car knows everything. He reached the ground floor and pushed through the door into the main lobby. The chaos of reporters at the entrance had thinned now, replaced by a handful of tired nurses and a few family members sitting quietly on benches. The smell of antiseptic was sharper here, but Sundar barely noticed. He kept his eyes on the glass doors ahead, where the faint reflection of the black car waited outside, steady and still like a predator lurking at the edge of the woods. As he stepped outside, the heat of the sun hit him again, and for a moment the world seemed too bright, too loud. Horns blared in the distance. Children laughed somewhere down the street, and a vendor was calling out the price of his fruit, all of it colliding against the heavy silence inside Sundar's chest. But his feet kept moving, one after the other, toward the car. When he was just a few feet away, the rear window rolled down with a smooth, deliberate motion. Inside sat a man, maybe in his 40s, with dark sunglasses that hid his eyes and a faint, unreadable smile on his lips. His suit was perfectly pressed, his posture relaxed, but there was something in the way he held himself, a kind of stillness, like a coiled snake, that made Sundar stop just short of the door. "Mr. Pichai," the man said. His voice was low and carrying easily above the hum of the street. "I wondered when you would come." Sundar stared at him for a moment, his mind turning over 100 questions, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as though amused. "Someone who has been watching this little drama unfold for quite some time. You know about Shanta, about her son." "I know more than you do," the man replied smoothly. "And more than she does, if we're being honest." That last sentence made Sundar's stomach knot. He took a step closer, gripping the top of the open window. "Then tell me, what really happened to Vikram? And who are those men taking him away?" The man chuckled softly, not cruelly, but with the kind of calm superiority that only deepened Sundar's anger. "Do you really want to know? Because once you do, there's no going back." "I want to know," Sundar said firmly. Though his voice betrayed a faint tremor. The man studied him for a moment longer, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, placing it on the seat beside him. "Inside here is everything. You need to understand names, dates, places, but there is a price for opening it. Sundar frowned. What kind of price? The man's smile faded slightly. Knowledge is heavy, he said simply. Once you carry it, you can't put it down. There was a long, tense silence. Sundar felt the weight of the choice pressing on him. The easy thing would be to walk away. To pretend this was just another sad story, to let it fade into the blur of his busy life. But then he thought of Shanta's hands clutching her son's photograph. He thought of the boy's pale face, the faint beep of the heart monitor, the way the two men had come and taken him away. Like he was nothing more than cargo. He reached in through the window and picked up the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it, but his voice was steady now. If you know so much, he said, then why are you helping me? The man leaned back in his seat, folding his hands over his chest. Because someone has to, he said quietly. And because you're the only one who might still care enough to do something. Before Sundar could respond, the window slid up again, shutting him out. The car's engine purred to life, and it pulled away from the curb in a smooth, deliberate motion, disappearing into traffic within seconds. Sundar stood there for a long moment, staring after it, the envelope burning in his hand. He turned it over and saw nothing. No writing, no markings. Just plain, unassuming paper. But it felt heavier than it should, as though the secrets inside. It already knew what they would cost him. He slipped it into his pocket and walked back toward the hospital steps. Halfway there, he felt it, the faint sense of being watched. He stopped and glanced back, scanning the street. And that's when he saw her. On the opposite sidewalk, standing perfectly still, was a young woman. Her clothes were plain, her hair pulled back neatly, but her gaze was fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. She didn't flinch when he met her eyes. She didn't move at all. And then, so faintly he thought he might have imagined it, she mouthed two words, "Don't open," before he could react. A bus passed between them, blocking his view for a moment. When it rumbled on, she was gone. Sundar stood there, frozen, the words echoing in his mind, "Don't open," but his hand was already moving toward the envelope in his pocket. His fingers traced the edge of the flap, and he felt the faint tremor, his own pulse quickening. He walked to a quiet corner of the hospital courtyard and sat down on a bench shaded by a sprawling tree. The sounds of the city were muted here, the air cooler, but his mind was anything but calm. He turned the envelope over one more time, looking for some clue, but it remained stubbornly blank. Finally, he slipped his finger under the flap and tore. It opened. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No photographs, no files, just a list of 3 names written in neat, deliberate handwriting. And at the bottom of the page, a short sentence that made his blood run cold. Start with the first name. But know this, once you knock, the door won't close again. Sundar read the names over and over, his heart hammering louder each time. He didn't recognize them, but something about the finality of that warning, "The door won't close again," made his throat go dry. He folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope, tucking it deep into his jacket pocket. He sat there on the bench for a long moment, staring at the ground, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle over him. Like a heavy cloak. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number. "You've opened it. Now you must come to the warehouse at Pier 17. Bring the names. And don't be late." Sundar stared at the screen, his mind spinning. Pier 17. A warehouse. The names. Everything was moving faster now, and he felt like he was being swept into a current he couldn't fight. He stood slowly, his knees feeling unsteady, and began walking toward the street again. Behind him, the shadow of the tree stretched long across the ground, and for a moment it looked almost like a hand reaching for him when he stepped out into the sun. He caught another glimpse of the young woman from earlier, just for a second, standing in the distance. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes met his one last time before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. Sundar looked down at the names in his pocket. Then back up at the horizon where the warehouses by the water lay waiting dot and somewhere deep in his chest. He felt the door begin to open. Asterisk the warehouse at Pier 17. City was falling into dusk by the time Sundar reached the waterfront. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil, and the cries of seagulls circled overhead like distant warnings. He walked along the cracked concrete pier, his shoes crunching over loose gravel and cigarette butts, the faint slap of water against the dock echoing somewhere below. Behind him, the city lights glittered faintly, but ahead of him lay only the dark outline of the warehouses, cold and quiet, like sleeping giants. He checked the message on his phone again, though he had memorized it already. Pier 17. Bring the names, and don't be late. His fingers grazed the envelope tucked into his jacket pocket, feeling the faint outline of the 3 names written on the paper. He still didn't know who they were, but every step toward the warehouse made their weight heavier, as if each name carried not just a story but a warning. The door won't close again. Those words echoed in his mind. Now, with every heartbeat got, he reached the end of the pier and stopped in front of a massive steel door streaked with rust. Above it, the number 17 was painted in faded white, barely visible in the dim light. He stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the cool evening air, his hands resting against the cold metal of the door. Then, gathering himself, he pushed it open inside. The warehouse was vast and hollow, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the cavernous darkness. Only a single light bulb hung from the ceiling in the center of the room, casting a faint yellow circle on the concrete floor below. And in that circle stood a table. On the table was a single black folder, and behind the table, waiting, was the man from the black car. He was still wearing his sunglasses despite the dim light, still perfectly composed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. But this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men flanked him, tall, broad, their faces unreadable, their presence unmistakably threatening. "You came?" the man said evenly, as though he had never doubted it. Sundar stepped forward cautiously. "I brought the names." "Good," the man replied, inclining his head slightly. "You're already further than most." Sundar stopped just outside the circle of light, his eyes fixed on the black folder. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "What I want," the man said slowly, "is irrelevant. What matters now is what you're willing to give." Sundar frowned. "What does that mean?" The man gestured toward the table. "Open it, then we'll talk." Sundar hesitated for only a moment before stepping into the light. The folder felt cool and heavy in his hands as he opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white, but clear enough to see what they showed. He'd picked up the first one and felt his stomach turn. It was a picture of Vikram, lying in the street on the night of the accident, but the angle was different from the photo in the news. It showed him looking up at someone, his face twisted in pain and fear. And above him, blurred but unmistakable, was the figure of a man in a suit leaning over him, not to help, but to press something into his hand. Something small and metallic. Sundar flipped to the next photo. It showed Shanta standing outside the hospital, speaking to a different man, not one of the doctors, but another stranger in a suit. She was crying, but the man's face was calm, almost bored, as though he were waiting for her to finish. He looked up at the man in sunglasses. "What is this?" The man tilted his head slightly. "Evidence, the truth. The accident wasn't random. It wasn't even an accident." Sundar's chest tightened. "Why?" The man took off his sunglasses then, revealing sharp, dark eyes that glinted in the dim light. "Because Vikram was carrying something he shouldn't have, and now there are people who will do anything to get it back." Sundar swallowed hard, the pieces starting to come together in his mind. "And Shanta?" The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She doesn't know. She thinks she's just fighting to save her son's life. She doesn't understand what he got himself into. But you're in a position to help." Sundar shook his head, backing away slightly. "I don't understand." "Why me?" The man stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Because he gave it to someone before he was hit, and that someone works for you." Sundar froze. The weight of the words pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. What do you mean? He managed to ask. The man's smile widened. You'll figure it out. The names in that envelope, those are the people who know where it is. Now, you find it, you save him. You fail, and his story ends here. For a long moment, the warehouse was silent, except for the faint creak of the rafters above. Finally, Sundar spoke, his voice low but steady. What happens if I refuse? The man's smile disappeared. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Then you'll never see him again, and neither will she. The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Sundar stared back at him, his mind racing, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then, without another word, he closed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, the man called after him. One more thing, he said, his tone almost casual. Sundar stopped, but didn't turn around. The girl, the man continued, the one who told you not to open it. She's not what she seems. She works for them. Sundar's breath caught, but he didn't answer. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped back into the cool night air outside. The pier was quiet now, the city lights twinkling faintly in the distance. He stood there for a long moment, letting the breeze wash over him, trying to quiet the storm inside his chest. Then he pulled out the piece of paper with the 3 names, unfolded it, and stared at the first one. A single street address was scrawled next to it. He closed his eyes, took a slow breath, and started walking toward the waiting city. The folder tucked under his arm, the paper in his pocket. But as he passed the shadows along the edge of the pier, he caught a glimpse of movement, just for an instant. And when he turned, he saw her again. The girl. She stood there in the darkness, watching him with that same quiet intensity. And this time, she didn't mouth words. She just raised a single finger to her lips, a silent command. Then she melted back into the shadows before he could speak. Sundar stood frozen on the edge of the pier, staring into the darkness where she had disappeared, the folder heavy in his arms, the names burning in his pocket, and a single thought carving itself deeper and deeper into his mind. Who could he trust? Behind him, in the depths of the warehouse, the man's faint laughter carried out into the night. The first name of city. Seemed quieter that night as Sundar made his way toward the address written beside the first name. He walked through streets he barely recognized anymore, his mind heavy with questions and the weight of everything he'd learned. The folder under his arm felt colder with every step, and the paper with the names in his pocket burned like a secret no one should ever have to carry. He kept seeing their faces. Shanta, her son lying pale in the hospital bed, the man in the black car, the girl in the shadows, each one watching him, each one pulling him in a different direction. And underneath it all, the question that refused to leave him alone. Who could he trust? The address led him to a narrow alley in an old part of the city where the buildings leaned close together like tired old men whispering to each other. The streetlights here flickered and hummed, casting long, crooked shadows on the walls. He stopped in front of a rusty metal door with no sign above it. Only the faint outline of a number, 24, painted in peeling white. He stood there for a long time, his hand hovering just above the handle, wondering if he really wanted to open it. But then he thought of Shanta again, sitting quietly by her son's bed, whispering prayers that no one else could hear. And with that, he pushed the door open. Inside was a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of dust and old wood. A single lamp on a table in the center illuminated a man sitting in a chair, his back to Sundar. The man didn't move when Sundar entered, didn't even turn his head. Only after Sundar shut the door behind him did the man speak, his voice low and cracked, like a record that had been played too many times. You shouldn't have come here. Sundar swallowed hard and stepped closer. You're the first name. The man laughed softly, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. I stopped. Being in a long time ago, Sundar took another step, studying him. His shoulders were hunched, his hair streaked with gray. his hands resting in his lap like he was waiting for something, or for nothing at all. You know what happened to Vikram? Sundar said carefully. That the man stiffened slightly. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. They're not after him. They're after what he carries. Sundar frowned. What does that mean? The man's fingers tapped against his knee, the rhythm nervous and uneven. Vikram stumbled into something bigger than him. Bigger than all of us. Something he shouldn't have seen. Something he shouldn't have touched. They tried to scare him, then they tried to silence him. And when he ran, they sent her. That last word hung in the air like smoke. Who? Sundar asked. The man finally turned his head, and Sundar felt a chill crawl up his spine. The man's eyes were sunken, but sharp, and they locked onto Sundar's with a kind of weary intensity. The girl? Sundar's chest tightened. He remembered her, standing in the shadows, raising a finger to her lips, silently telling him not to open the envelope. But she warned me, Sundar said. Quietly, the man gave a faint, sad smile. That's what she does. She pretends to help. She leads you just far enough, and then she closes the door behind you. Sundar felt a knot form in his stomach. So why tell me this? Why not just let them take him? The man's hands curled into fists on his knees. Because she doesn't always win. Sometimes. Someone decides not to play her game. He leaned forward then, his voice hardening. You still have a choice, Mr. Pichai. You can give them the names. Hand it all over, walk away, and they'll let you go. They'll let you go. They'll let Shanta live. But her son, he'll disappear, and no one will ask where he went. Sundar shook his head slowly, his throat dry. And if I don't? The man's gaze didn't waver. Then you'll never be safe again. And neither will they. But you'll have the truth. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the lamp. Sundar looked down at the folder in his hands, the names written inside his pocket. The choice that lay in front of him like a blade. He thought of Shanta's hands clutching. The quiet dignity in her eyes. The boy in the hospital bed. The girl in the shadows. The man's bitter smile. He thought of his own mother back in India. Of all the people who had believed in him. When he had nothing but dreams and stubbornness. And then he made his choice. He pulled the envelope of names from his pocket. Tore it cleanly in half. And dropped the pieces onto the floor. The man watched him without speaking. A faint glimmer of something. Respect. Perhaps flickering in his tired eyes. So be it. The man murmured. Sundar turned and left the room, his footsteps quiet, but sure. Outside, the night had deepened, the stars faint but present above the city skyline. He walked back through the alley, past the flickering streetlights, back to the streets that thrummed with life. The air felt sharper now, each breath like a promise he couldn't yet name. When he reached the corner, he saw her again. The girl, she was standing under a street lamp, her face shadowed, her hands folded neatly in front of her. When he approached, she lifted her gaze to his and tilted her head slightly, as though disappointed. You made your choice, she said softly. Sundar stopped just a few feet away, his own voice steady now. I did.